appealed to me, because one of my personal bugbears in life is how many people there are out there who don't appear to be thinking much for themselves at all, and as a consequence often don't really seem to know what they're talking about. And we see this in all sorts of areas. I think about the early days of take-up of electric vehicles, the debate about hydrogen or heat exchangers, or just so many things where people will talk about bioplastic as an example as a wonderful thing without stopping to think, well, what actually is bioplastic and how is it any different from ordinary plastic? To which the answer is, for almost all of it, not at all. It's just made a different way. It's just as bad for the environment. And the constant undercurrent to all of this is perhaps people dealing with or not dealing with change. And that is something which is incredibly important for the world we're in. The other thread that appealed to me is everything around regeneration. We hear lots of talk about regenerative agriculture and regenerative economics, although again, I suspect many of the people throwing these terms around maybe haven't thought quite hard enough for themselves about what they really are. Anyway, with that as introduction, I very much look forward to this discussion. Let me throw it over to my co-host, Paul, to take us into it. Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Nigel. Welcome, everybody. Great to have everybody back in the ESGX community, and to learn today from one of the sources of super innovative thinking, somebody I would call an expert, but Carol would not self-identify. So we'll talk about that as to how to create an identity. And to, of course, not only talk about Carol's latest book, No More Gold Stars, but all of her books, which have started from the responsible business and responsible society to the regenerative business, regenerative society, regenerative life, including implications for portfolios. So we know from those of you who've signed up, or those of you who are watching this, that you want to take your game to the next level. And the game is making the world better and to create human, social, and environmental impact, and to make that a sustainable activity for the well-being of all of us, for the well-being of nature, and to make it an economic model that can work, which has been part of Carol's life through most of her professional career. So in the chat, please feel free to ask questions in the chat. I've put the link to carolsanford.com and her books. And so welcome, Carol. It's great to have you with us. And I'll just preview it as we get into this. Carol wants everybody to know she has an advanced form of ALS. So Carol's brain is going 500 miles an hour. Her mouth has slowed to a more reasonable speed limit. And so if you hear her talking slowly, know that her brain is moving fast, though her tongue is catching up. Welcome, Carol.
Thank you, Paul. That's really, really true. I can't no longer talk as fast as I have ideas, but if I slow down, you can understand the ones I offer. So thanks for the forewarning.
Well, great to have you with us. And, we've both been part of book launches. This is the latest book launch. It's amazing to me, not only that you've written 7 books, so, chasing Peter Drucker and other people who write lots of books. I was listening to David Brooks on a podcast the other day, and somebody asked him a question, and they said, oh, well, that's a complicated question. That's why I write books. So that's what we're going to dig into today, because you address so many important questions in a visionary way and bring your everyday experience to it, and which is so compelling. So why the 7th book? So you have 6 books already. What are we learning in the new 7th book?
My first book, which is When You and I Met, was really about getting people to quit talking about sustainability in a way that was so limited. And so it was very direct at people. But over the years, as I gave more details, I realized that people were missing a very core idea, which is an epistemological idea. Now, that's a very academic philosophy term, but it means how we learn and how we change. And that people were seeking to transfer good ideas to people directly, teach them how to follow, and it was increasingly putting people to sleep. People have stopped figuring out and thinking for themselves, and instead they're borrowing, thinking unexamined, adopting it unexamined, and most of what's being put out right now around making the world work is pretty small because it's put in books and programs. It's got 6 steps, and my belief is much of how things are being transferred is now the problem we've got. So therefore, no more gold stars, where the method is incentives, rewards, behavioral, and it undermines and supplants people thinking for themselves.
Okay, so that's one of the core concepts that in the book is sort of this reconnection with Socratic questions, with self-discovery. But there's also accumulated knowledge that we all have. So I know you're sensitive about the term expert. So how do you identify, if not as an expert, how do you identify? And how do we collect cumulative knowledge while being pursuing self-discovery?
So I'm not very interested in collecting knowledge. I'm interested in advancing knowledge, but I'm interested in being, and from lived experience. My books are based a lot on what I learned from my grandfather, who was half Mohawk. And so I grew up in an indigenous learning process where my grandfather didn't teach me things to know, but ways to know. And most of those ways to know were to try on things and see how they work. There's a real problem with our knowledge collection system right now and our knowledge acquisition, which is everybody now says, well, you got to have science to stand behind it. But the problem with that is the modern science we have is fragmented and it studies things in parts and pieces. And my grandfather would always say, you can't understand a tree or a forest even without understanding its home, how it fits in to a system at work. And you can't understand bears and even beavers without understanding the dinner table that's in the water and how all that works together. So our modern science is dissects a frog and then studies it without movement, without understanding how it works. So the science quote that we're accumulating is at least half wrong, according to indigenous people and even quantum mechanics, and even wise elders who have wisdom traditions. They say we're accumulating false premises. So the reason I don't like the term expert, and I only call myself a person who is in the pursuit of understanding, less in the pursuit of knowledge. An expert is the opposite of thinking for ourselves. It's handing over that hard work of having the mind learn to engage and develop itself to somebody who claims that they're at the top of the hierarchy, and therefore we don't bother to test it with our lives. And we have something called best practices. So we pick them up, and you can't even customize them because when you go from one place to another, one time to another, one part of the river to another, one community to another, you have to start with what's the essence of that place. So I don't like the idea of authorities or experts or anyone who claims that they have the answer because you can't know until you learn how to test knowledge with your own lived experience. So I've set up a couple of communities that for the last almost 50 years have been teaching people to do that as business teams or as change agents, as individuals. How do you really learn not only to think for yourself, but teach people how to do that? So even in my books, well, two things in the book, I tell you how we got into this mess 125 years ago. And I suggest that you don't trust anything I say either. You have to test it. So we develop more process of how to learn how to develop than what. So I think I answered all three of your questions.
Okay.
And that.
Nigel, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was going to make an observation that is, perhaps 100, 125 years ago, certainly in the realm of science, it was possible for one person to learn most of what had been learned and to get to the forefront in science quite broadly. Of course, today, the most you can hope to be is one of these fearsome experts in an incredibly narrow area of knowledge. And the challenge we're dealing with, so many of the problems we face in the world, and indeed so many practical problems in businesses and in society, are complicated problems where it's not a problem which needs an expert to solve it. It needs I think exactly what you're saying, which is somehow to be able to sit with what is the essence of the world that you're dealing with or the problem that you're dealing with, and then start to look for knowledge on which you can then build your own understanding of what is going on and why. And my question was going to be, because I'm just really agreeing with all you've said and supporting it, what is the kind of gateway drug to get people excited about or to actually follow the advice you're giving? What is it? What is the hook that really gets people engaged in having the confidence to say, I'm going to try to understand this problem and bring wisdom to it, rather than calling the expert?
I don't think it's complicated. I think it's complex. And I think those are very different things. Where complex means a system at work. Complicated means a bunch of data and information, which is overwhelming us. And I strongly suggest people stop collecting information through reading every book. A young man just asked on LinkedIn this morning what books he should read to work on his PhD. I said, very few, very, very few, because what you're doing is cluttering your mind with the equivalent of fragments. And so what you're talking about is to get people interested is usually it takes some kind of conscious shock. The company gets in trouble, it gets a new CEO, it gets a raider, or it gets a very wise person who amazingly didn't lose who they were, climbing into the position of some authority. The way all of and I've got in my 7 books, I've got over 100 case stories of CEOs, and they write the forward so people know I'm not making it up. And they tell people that you'll make 35 to 65% revenue growth each year for the next few years after you start this, and it'll level out to about 20, even if you're in a low margin business. So that isn't enough though, but it's an underpinning to say this stuff ain't crazy. All of my clients have come in one of 3 ways to this. One is by referral. One CEO tells another over the last 50 years, and then they've got the story that goes with it. Secondly, they come because of writing or speaking. As I've keynoted I don't know, I lost track after 1,000 conferences where they hear something. And the third way is that they are personally seekers and literally are checking, trying to find out who is it has something, because they see most of it not working. Now, why those three? I think the real answer to your question is there's an old Sufi philosopher, I guess you'd call him, who said there's something he calls magnetic center, which is inside of all of us, is something that wants to make a difference. It's in Nigel, it's in Paul, it's in everybody that's on this call, and otherwise you wouldn't come looking. And it gets covered up with worry and fear and identification with certain ideologies, attachment, ego. It gets covered up in a world that we don't structure to develop people. We structure to cram them full of knowledge. And so if you could reduce the process that builds up people's energy and space and develop the capacity to deal with all these fears and the identification also, that magnetic center can reach the opportunity. So I always tell my members of my institute, your job is to get the word out and to do it in a way that people can feel that it's what they've been looking for. And if you do that, you will find eventually 2 to 3% of people who want us, who see the difference. And that 2 to 3% can change everything. And there's research showing that. The critical mass is not everyone. It's a limited number who are determined and who stick with it and keep developing themselves. So the 8-way drug is development of people so that the systems ran aren't such a mess. What do you think of that, Nigel?
It is a never-ending challenge. I think one big problem many people face, because Gil asked a great question in here about, how do we help people realize the desperate addiction they have to knowledge, lists, and data. And one of the challenges is so many people in their working lives are so busy, they have less and less time for everything. And I can think of CEOs that get completely distracted from the strategic development of their large listed company for literally a year or two, because all this short-term stuff gets in the way. And all of that noise stops people from really trying to sit back and think and understand. I think it's genuinely challenging to escape all of that noise. And yet if you do, go on.
In every book I write, the last chapter, except I think the first one, says you can't do this without a community that you're in ongoingly, that's developing itself and meeting regularly. And for the last 3 years, mine's all been online. But the real key is you have to be with people who are seeking to development, or they are pulled into that morass you describe. And if you are reminded, that's why I go to me a couple of times a month. And I have people who've been in there over 40 years. And it's what keeps the will being regenerated, because it's really hard work.
Yeah, so I'll just, part of my job today is to help reinforce all the knowledge and experience that Carol has brought together. She's done this through 7 books so far, her latest book, her 7th book, despite battling advanced ALS which is why she's speaking slowly. She's not thinking slowly, but she's just speaking slowly today. And just like each story has like an emotional, visceral connection. But what I really appreciate about everything you write, Carol, is that it's always been embedded with a multi-sector view. And so today's problems are really multi-sector. And so our solutions have to be multi-sector and multidisciplinary. And as a multidisciplinary problem solver your whole life, I'm wondering what best practices you've done to immerse yourself in other domains or disciplines. So some people have like dinner parties, some people, go out and, bring people together in some way, like you talked about in your institute. Like, what are practices that we can all follow to keep our minds open, to keep our, problem solving capacity in action?
So you're not gonna like my answer, I'm pretty sure. The first thing is I never do anything twice. Never do the same thing in the same way. And so I'm not allowed to go look up anything I've already written as an answer to a current question. I come to a place in the book and I say, well, I need to talk about this. I can't say, what have I said? I have to go generate a whole new way of thinking about it. And that is a driver. That means I have no best practices, none. Because if I use something I've used before, I use frameworks to look at things, and all those frameworks have cross-stakeholder connection in. And so I'm making my mind do the work each time. That means I have to regenerate a thought about any subject I think I already know something on. And I don't meet with modern people or read modern books. So again, that's kind of the opposite of what you would think. I require my sources be 100 years or more older, and their ideas have been tested that long. Because I think that popular psychology has really wrecked the process of where we get ideas and how we do it. Like you said, go meet with people. Nope, I don't meet. I am very much an introvert and an isolationist. I live in a 600 square foot apartment. No, it's bigger than that, 900. And looking at the trees outside my window, I don't participate in anything anyone does, but driving myself to never ever do anything the same way twice or have the same idea is what I call long thought thinking. I don't mean a long time. I mean taking one thought, and I'll give you an example. Let's see, when did I graduate from college? In 1967, I was in a visiting scholars classroom named Thomas Kuhn. He wrote the structure of the scientific revolution, and it had just been published that year or the year before. And he introduced an idea, I'd never heard the word, paradigm and paradigm shift. And in the evening at Berkeley, one of the things students often did is went with their professor to this place called the Rathskeller. And it was a coffee house and beer pub. And you could go down in the basement, and the students would follow like little ducklings over, and we would sit with the Coon, and he would tell stories like we're doing. And one of the students, not me, and his students were from all over the world, said, well, how do you get people to change paradigms? And he said, I figured out the idea. It's your job to answer that. And I felt like someone knocked me over in my chair. It's my job to figure out how paradigms get shifted. I was, 19 years old, 20 years old. and I just had my 81st birthday. That idea has driven me for 60 years. And I have written about the idea paradigm. I created my first evolutionary view of something in when I was 27. And it was based on how we build complex ideas so we can get through these morass that Nigel described so eloquently. So I pose big questions. It's how I work on it. I don't collectively talk to people because I find most people don't have the discipline to follow something for 60 years and never have the same thought they had 60 years ago. The 10 years later and 10 years and 10 years, you've moved the bar. You've demanded a whole new answer to that because you're growing and the people's experience with you and or in the world is growing. So I don't use people and I don't use popular anything. I go back to the ancient teachers. I go back to my grandfather's words and to Thomas Kuhn and to all the folks I hang out with in Tibetan Buddhism and even some Hindus like Sri Aurobindo. I go to people who've been asking these huge questions, not the mundane everyday, not that you don't want to apply it to that, but I don't learn from existence. I learn from finding out what is the essence of something and try to find it in a way no one else has seen it. So there's one other thing. My grandfather, when I was 7, named me the positive contrarian. And what he meant by that was that the minute someone said something, I would have a different view. Not to argue, not like some kids do, but I would see something. He said, you always see something other people, no matter how old they are seeing. But you always flip it to something you could do with it, not something that's wrong about what people say. So for me, it's always finding what I call errors in thinking. I'm doing a Substack blog and podcast, which is more writing, and my hands don't work or my tongue very well, so it's a difficult thing. But when I'm doing that, I'm doing it to give find the errors in thinking that help us see things upside down. And the reason I'm going to meet with people is if I say that to them and they're not in my communities, they're not much help to themselves or me. So I think you might not like my answer.
I'm learning from your answer, so I like or dislike, it's it's like learn or don't learn. So
yeah,
that's
I appreciate that.
Yeah, so similar. It's always listening for something that you haven't heard before. Is there an experience? One of the comments that I'm increasingly making about today's problems and the entrenched thoughts, some of them knuckle dragging, looking backwards, is, do you believe in logic? Do you believe in empathy? Do you believe in the lived human experience? Because if you do believe in logic, science, empathy, the lived human experience, then how could you turn away from trying to solve that problem? So that's there's so much variety and creativity in the world, and there's so much evolutionary biology that, as you're describing, always discovers the next thing. Nature usually doesn't repeat very often,
Right.
but it finds the next thing. And one of my favorite evolutionary biology stories is of 2 competing ant colonies in the Iberian Peninsula that constantly fight each other until there's a flood. And then when there's a flood, these 2 competing ant colonies lock together to float and survive the flood in unity to a common threat, and then float as long as it takes for the flood to subside. And then, because they're built to fight, they go back to fighting. So it's a super
Well,
interesting example of we can work together and we can collaborate, we can innovate while there's pressure, but then sometimes there's reversion. So it'd be interesting to hear about, your experience with that, how to not slip into the past.
well, I have a whole different interpretation. I wish I could remember all of it right now. I'm going to do what I can. That's a human projection on that story. It is not what's really going on with ants and how they work. We can't imagine that when they're in what looks like a battle to us, that they're actually doing the work of helping figure out how to do something. I wish I could remember. Elizabeth Sartorius has a different interpretation, and she's an evolutionary biologist. She said mostly we project ourselves onto stories with human interpretations, and therefore we don't ever come to look enough. So that has one intervention of flood, but what does it look like and how the system works that's bigger than the ants? My grandfather's question is you can't understand a forest without looking at its home and bears without looking at their dinner table. When you look at ants, you tend to project. So I'm sorry to do this to you, and I can't remember what the other interpretation was, but I remember what Elizabeth said about how that's probably not what's happening. It's a human projection.
I'm only human, so I'm susceptible.
Right. We all are. We all are. And that's one of the reasons I wrote one book called No More Feedback. Nearly all feedback we give people is projection of our worldview, our life experience. But you did say something I'd like to add to. You said that one of your questions is, do we trust a lived experience? That's a term I use because I learned it from my grandfather when I was really young. And said that's the only way to understand something. You can know things about it in school, but you can't understand it until you're living in it. And so in this book, I talk about one of the primary ways of learning is more than experiential, it's a lived experience. So we do in the classroom experiential training where we have them try it out for a minute or two. But if you ask people to take what I call a work idea, by the way, I'm working on book 8, to take a work idea and you try it in life and see how does it work for me? What is it doing? Can I reflect on the experience I'm having if I live this idea compared to what I was living? And that my grandfather said that's a primary learning means of the human animal, and we forget that. And so I really liked your question when you said that.
Well, I'm inspired. My wife, we celebrating our 25-year wedding anniversary this week, but one of the comments she has made is we're all exploding chemical factories. And so at any point in time, whether it's emotion or whether it's another feeling. So I'd like to know, and then one more comment on feedback. No More Feedback is definitely a positive contrarian title, but I find that when people give feedback, or even when I give feedback to somebody, I am putting it through my own lens, like I'm providing feedback on what I value or how I think about myself. And so I would say that if you do hear feedback, it's definitely telling you something maybe about you, but definitely about the other person and what they value. So there's at least hints for how to build relationships or how to listen for what people need as they express that. Do you have a perspective on that?
Oh God, I wrote a whole book on it. Where to start? The primary concern I have about feedback is it has a functional effect on our brain, and it has one we don't know about. And the reason is I give the whole history of the term feedback and where it came from. It came from a group of psychologists borrowing the term from how machines work. On the machines that have hot fluids or electrical danger, there's something called a governor. And the governor is designed to shut off the machine when it's going to cause harm, overflow oil or hot water. And feedback is the trigger mechanism to shut off the governor. And so it's not really how humans work. How humans work is learning context. And when we do that, we're trying to either consciously or unconsciously change their behavior, shut off what they're doing, and get them to do what we want to. But the problem is with humans, which are alive, is it shuts off the capacity to think. So think about when you get feedback, you usually go into what the machine calls runaway behavior, where it's gonna speed up because you can't get the feedback clamp on. That happens in our brains. We become processors of, is that true? That's not me. And we get into thinking about what they're saying in a way that's not reflective. It substitutes for our own capacity for consciousness. And if you do it long enough, and I have a little research when I did my doctoral work, which I think I put in 2 of my books, which was when you do it to kids, they learn to lie. And it's the primary mechanism for teaching them to lie, even though we don't know it. So feedback is never useful because there are so much better alternatives, which are not when you even think you're learning something about someone else, that's a projection. Both directions is a projection. You're telling people or interpreting them. So I offer in No More Feedback, the way we build organization. So it's all based on frameworks that we learn to use to be self-reflective and without all the things that trigger runaway and fear and so forth. So I'm sorry, I'm getting a little tired, so I can feel me shorthanded, but did that help?
Yes, very, very much so. And No More Feedback is one of Carol's 7 books. So we'll put this in the chat again. Carol's put a free chapter on the website that we just linked, which will definitely draw you in and want you to read each book and every book, which are so compelling. And Carol's brings her experience and brilliance too. Nigel, another question. We should probably wrap up in a few minutes because Carol's getting tired because she has advanced ALS, so which she just wants everybody to know. And as you've heard me before, I know her brain is going 500 miles an hour, even if her tongue is going a more legal speed limit.
I just had one reflection, and that was we had a little while ago a discussion on ESGX Live with Tyson Yunkaporta about his book, Sand Talk, How Aboriginal Thinking Can Save the World. And I remember one of the questions I asked him was, what is the one thing we need to do to try to get people to think differently? And of course, his answer was, there is no one thing. The whole idea of trying to find one thing is absolutely, the wrong way to approach it. And I think there's a lot of common themes in this, which is this whole obsession with facts and experts is a desire to go and find one quick, easy solution to some problem. And, you know, if your problem is you need milk in your coffee, then there's a nice, easy solution to that problem. But most of the real problems we're dealing with are not things which lend themselves to quick, easy solutions. And our whole mindset of trying to take that approach lets us down.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, all I would say to everybody listening here is, you know, I have not read your book yet, but quite a lot of, I think how I think about problems and how in the Pottinger world we try to think about problems is absolutely about trying to say, okay, what is the actual thing we've got in front of us here? You know, and not to try to bring some cookie cutter or quick, easy solution, or someone did it this way once, surely it will work again approach.
Right.
Because it's amazing how often that doesn't work, even at the simplest level of just trying to replicate you did something for someone else that was a bit similar. It's like, no, but this situation is different. Engage your brain, trust in your brain, and use it.
Well, develop your brain, because you can't trust it right now because it's been in society world and where it wasn't developed. It was crammed full of stuff. I also want to say I have two forwards to No More Gold Stars. One is by Tyson Yankaporta, and Tyson says in there, first he calls me Auntie because he thinks I'm the anti-Iran, but I'm also an elder to him. And so he interviews me on his podcast quite often. And the other chord is written by Tom Peters, the best all-time selling business book author for over 25 years. And I asked both of them because they're two different worlds. And I was trying to show how this book is trying to bring together those different paths. And Tom said it turned everything he's done for the last 45 years upside down. And it's a revolutionary book. And so anyway, I greatly appreciate them both. Tyson and I, well, we're always on the same page, except for a couple of things. It always makes for great conversation. You'll love his forward. It's written from an indigenous perspective that you would never expect to see in the forward of a book.
Fantastic.
And so some of that indigenous experience and storytelling and examples are in the No More Gold Stars book, which is Carol Sanford's latest book, her seventh. So Carol, anything in summary that you want to share? We want to be conscious of your energy and your health, and we're very grateful for you to invest this time to share with us. Is there anything else you'd like to wrap up with?
I mean, if people want to kind of follow where my mind's going nowadays, it's kind of fun to join Substack, which you can do for free. And I see several of the people's names popping up here with questions, and they're actually also members of Substack. So I also have. I can't do podcasts in the same way, obviously, I used to, but I'm doing them as co-host with my community members who are change agents. And so we're taking questions that are arising in the culture right now. I write a blog about it. We create a podcast and a little short interaction. So I'd invite people to come check that out. You've already shown where my website is for more on each book. Hi, Elizabeth. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Carol, for all that you've shared with us over your books, your work, our personal conversations, our time going to and from book events, and including one day in a burning taxi in Miami.
Yes.
That is unforgettable.
It was.
Which we survived, and we survived the Miami bus system after that. So very much appreciate you and all that you do. anybody that wants to follow up with Carol, it's carolsanford.com. Obviously, her books are there, her work is there, and her leadership is there and pervasive. And then Carol's, battling ALS. So if you have any suggestions on how to fund that solving ALS, please be in touch with Carol or me as well. So thanks to each of you for joining today. Please feel free to share the CSGX. It is recorded. It's recorded for all the people who RSVP'd and didn't come in person, and it's here recorded so you can share it about. So very much appreciate you, Carol, to Nigel Lake, my co-host in New York, Paul Herman here in Europe, and to Nick Gower, our producer. Thank you, everybody, for joining ESGX today, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Paul. It's been so nice to know you, and it's a life. And nice to meet you, Nigel. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Carol.